Our next speaker tonight is Helen Rouse, and Dr. Helen Rouse is the Regional Manager of National Institute of Water and Atmospheric Research, which is NIWA, of course, their Christchurch and Nelson offices. With a background in coastal geomorphology, her passion is working at the interface between science and policy, helping to communicate environmental science, whether it be coastal, freshwater or marine, and to inform resource and hazard management decision-making for the benefit of New Zealand's environment and communities. Helen was the leader of a government-funded research program looking at coastal adaptation to climate change between 2008 and 2011, one input of which was a guidance document for councils and communities called Pathways to Change, and many of us may have heard about that. More recently, she was a contributor to the New Zealand Coastal Society's Adapting to the Consequences of Climatic Change, Engaging with Communities publication. She was a panel member of the Royal Society of New Zealand's Climate Change Implication for New Zealand publication, and a lead author of a review paper looking at coastal adaptation to climate change in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Helen, we're very fortunate to have you here with us tonight, and Helen's going to present to us tonight on coastal issues and local community engagement. Welcome, Helen Rouse.
So thank you very much for inviting me here to speak with you tonight. And I need to start off my talk by acknowledging some NIWA colleagues. Doctors Paula Blackett and Rob Bell are respectively community engagement and sea level rise gurus within NIWA and somewhat within New Zealand, so they've helped with some of the slides for my presentation this evening. And I also do need to just thank or acknowledge funding that I did receive a few years ago. I was involved in a research project where we looked at coastal adaptation to climate change and working with communities, and hopefully I'll get to talk about a case study from that work as well this evening. So what I need to do, or what I'd like to do first, I'm talking on that topic of coastal adaptation and how we might engage communities. I'd like to start by giving you the key messages. So these are the points that I'm hoping to get to. So I'll give you these first in case I do run out of time, and then I'll go and kind of flesh in a little bit more information as we go on. And thanks for the nice setup of the introductory talk to help lay some weight behind some of the statements. The first one is that our climate is changing. While the climate change science is complex, there is a large degree of agreement between scientists about evidence of the amount of sea levels have risen over the last couple of 100 years, and certainty around the projections that they will continue to rise for the next few hundred years as well. So the uncertainty in those sea level rise projections are not about if, but when certain sea level rises may come to pass. Our coasts are, New Zealand coasts are very valued by us all, and the sea level rise and things like the increased storminess that we've heard about will mean that there will be increased hazards at our coasts. They will increase risks that we really need to have a bit of a think about how we might adapt and change to those exacerbated hazards in the future. So we need to decide what we're going to do about that. And to do that, it will be really useful to engage with our communities as we think about some of the options. Involving communities in that decision-making process will help them to understand some of the risks and trade-offs of the various different pathways that might lie ahead for us. So there are, though, many challenges to having large kind of community discussions about the kinds of complex issues we might have ahead of us, and so it's going to be hard. It's going to require a commitment of time and money on all sides. But do not despair, because there is guidance. So the Ministry for the Environment that we've already heard about, who are responsible for providing some leadership in New Zealand in some of the climate change policy and direction areas, have developed a guidance manual that I'll kind of mention a few times as we go through the talk. So I'll now, as I said, just kind of go on to put some detail in underneath those key messages for this evening. So our coast, the New Zealand coast is very dynamic and very diverse, from our ecological communities, mangroves in Northland or black corals in Southland. We've got hard rock coasts and cliffs. We've got beaches that are very dynamic. We've got estuarine environments and coastal lakes or hapua. We've got a big diversity in the type of coastal environments that we have. And our coasts are something that we really value, so whether it's for walking the dog or surfing, or it's where we've got a holiday home or where we live, or it's where our coastal communities are based, and with lots of the assets that go with that, then we really kind of have a large value on our coastal areas. Our coasts are highly populated as well. It's where the coastal plains are where we came and settled when we first got to New Zealand. In these coastal areas, though, we're exposed to multiple hazards, so things like erosion of those coastal areas, erosion of our beaches, and flooding from various areas, whether it's because of rain flooding or whether it's weather-driven kind of storms and storm surge flooding, or even tsunamis. So there's a range of hazards we have at the coast. And when those hazards interact with the assets that we have on the coast, then we've got a problem that we need to think about. And climate change is going to exacerbate all of those types of hazards and increase our sea levels. So we've had some good setup now that's going to help you to interpret this diagram. So in this top area, we've got a graph very similar to some of the ones that we've seen already. This is sea level rise, and we have the kind of historic trend of data, which is noisy, as we've seen, and then going forward from there, two projections in this diagram from two of the RCP or emission scenarios going forward. We have over here in the main diagram just some of the projections going forward from 2000 to 2120. And we've got, again, these kind of emission scenarios, different future possibilities. And with the kind of low emissions world up to the higher emissions world, we've got sea level rises that range from about 0.5 of a metre up to kind of 1 and a bit. And then if we look at this kind of, this dashed line here is, we've heard about the kind of the range of the projections, and this is one of the upper ranges that's been talked about as the upper likely range, which is about 1.4 metres potential of sea level rise. So to put those things into context, a modest sea level rise of 0.3 to 0.4 metres, which the graph shows we could potentially get to by 2050 or 2060, converts something that's a kind of 1 in 100, so quite a rare storm event, to something that might happen once a year. And if you look at a sea level rise of about 0.8 of a metre, then a similarly kind of high tide is something that happens 90% of the time, so it's almost every day. So that's quite a shift in the kind of the occurrence of the kind of high water levels that we're used to, that those kind of sea level rise introduce for us. So with all of that ahead of us, we need to think about adapting, where adaptation is a way of either minimising threats or maximising opportunities that might come from those changes. And my apologies for focusing more in the talk about threats than the opportunities. Those threats, as I've said, are posed by the kind of exacerbated natural hazards. So it might be beaches eroding, it might be more flooding. As sea levels rise, then there's a potential for salt water to infiltrate into any coastal aquifers that there are. Actually, when you've got those higher sea levels as well and the higher base levels, then in an earthquake, then liquefaction is also kind of more likely. And then there's this thing called coastal squeeze. So our coastal environments have a certain area. How beaches and things react to the sea levels coming in and seas encroaching is to kind of roll back from the sea. And if we've got hard infrastructure behind that, then the area that our coastal environments have to survive in gets kind of squeezed, and everything at the coast can get squeezed with those kind of beach changes that happen with the increasing sea levels. This diagram is taken from the Ministry for the Environment guidance document, and this is just a kind of re-emphasising some of the things that I've said about the assets and the importance of that at the coast. And so we can see that Canterbury has a high number of residences, people, and rail and roads assets that are at threat from kind of sea level rise. So there's things to think about here in Canterbury. And so clearly what we need to do is to start to think about what we're going to do and come up with a bit of a plan. There are three kind of main things that I'm just going to mention briefly, which are ways to adapt at the coast. And these are to protect the coast. So that is to kind of say, the coastline is here, it's been a static thing, we'd like it to stay there, so we're going to do something to try and hold the line. And the kind of traditional way that we've done that has been to use seawalls, so that's a picture from Oriental Bay in the 1950s, but obviously it's still what we're doing now in some of our communities where we've decided that we really need to protect assets that are there and hold the line against the encroaching sea. So protect is one way forward. Accommodate is another way, so really that's about acknowledging that there might be some give and take of floods and erosion and that we might need to think about ways that we can make space for that to happen. Some of that has been done kind of through planning so that you've got things like coastal parks near the coast so that if there's flooding that there's not too much kind of impact of that flood event. But another way that's, in part it's holding the line, but in part it's allowing for some natural process, is to think about sand dunes and using those as kind of coastal defences. And that photograph shows some native pingo growing on the sand dunes at South New Brighton. And then we have the idea of retreat. So there might be some assets that we decide are at the coast that we can't afford to protect or defend, or we decide that actually it will just be easier if we move individual assets or even whole communities inland. But clearly we need to think quite carefully about our priorities and only really move the important things. So the Ministry for the Environment guidance, just to kind of give you an outline of that, this diagram outlines the 10-step process that guidance suggests that we could follow to help think about how we might adapt to climate change. There are 5 kind of key areas, 5 key questions around it, which I'll come back to in a moment. But at the centre of that diagram is community participation, because of that importance of having communities involved in those conversations. So how might we go about that? This is another diagram that is from the Ministry's document, or is a version of it is in the Ministry's document, and that talks about how we might kind of engage with people. It shows on one end of this participation spectrum things that were maybe used to be the more traditional way that we would go about thinking about how we would do things, and that would be to come up with a draft and then to inform or consult people and get feedback on that and move forward from there. But as we move along the spectrum, we talk about different processes that might involve people more and more, so actually their input and advice is part of the decision-making process in terms of what decisions are made for pathways forward. And those kind of processes are more common these days in New Zealand. For example, this is a diagram that's related to the National Policy Statement for Freshwater Management. So there's obviously an emphasis in managing different resources like freshwater to also include community in those decisions. So it's perhaps unsurprising that we're looking for that involvement in our climate change management too. So, as I said, just to go back to the guidance document and to quickly look at there were 5 questions in that circle in the decision-making diagram, and the communities can participate in all of those areas. So the first part is by understanding what could happen, when, where, and what that might mean. And so that, as I've said, is to understand for a local community what sea level rise might be, what type of inundation or amounts of erosion might result. The next ways that communities can contribute is to help to understand the things that are important. So those things that are valued about the community, whether it's the beach, a boat ramp, the local hospital that's only a few blocks back, or whatever it might be. We need to really understand all of the things that are important to all members of the community, so that we can think about the next step, which is what are the different adaptation options that you could put in place that would help to manage those things that you value. So the next couple of points I'm not going to focus too much on in this presentation, but that's really getting into the nitty-gritty of adaptation planning as it's kind of outlined in the guidance manual. So there are many different ways that you could think about planning for the future. As I said, the uncertainty to a certain extent around the sea level rise is not the if but when. So one of the ways that you can adapt to climate change is to think not, oh, we need to plan for something that will happen in 2020, and it may or may not. Shouldn't say 2020, should I? Because that's just very soon. 2080s. You know, but you might think about we need to plan for what we would do if the sea level gets to 0.4 of a metre, and it doesn't matter whether that's in 10 years' time or 50 years' time, we need to have a plan for what we would do when that happens. And then the final step, as always, is by keeping an eye then on how things are going and seeing if you need to adapt the plan along the way. So that kind of dynamic adaptive pathways is what the guidance manual talks about in terms of a process that's open to communities. So have I still got a couple of minutes, I thought? I do, right, okay. So I'll just share with you quickly then a case study that is when I talked previously about a project that I was involved with looking at coastal adaptation to climate change and how we might engage with some communities. So we did a case study where we were involved up in Whitianga in the Coromandel, and we had a bit of a think about how we might go about working with the community to get them to help us think about adaptation for some of the issues they had going on. And we use this this mapping process. This photo here kind of shows a nice big aerial photo of the community, and on that we had outlined some projections of potential future situations that might happen in terms of flooding or coastal erosion or habitat change as you go up the Whitianga estuary. So we kind of made those projections, we mapped that out, and then we went through a two-stage process. The first of that was an open day, so just a big community day where we invited people to come in and find out more, and started with a time tunnel. So we had information available about how Whitianga had changed over the last 100 years and the kinds of hazard events that had been happening over the last 100 years to kind of get people thinking that change is something that happens frequently. And then they got to see the projections that we had got for them in terms of what climate change impacts there might be for the coasts that they're interested in, and we asked them to get little flags and to mark on those flags things that they valued. Now for some people it was a bench that they sat when they walked the dog, for some it was the boat ramp, for some it was, you know, local businesses or whatever, but we went through a process to identify all of those things that were valued by the community. And one of the big bits around that was the way we did that was one-on-one interactions with people available, experts available to talk to the community to understand a bit more about the science behind it and what that might mean for them. And then the next stage in this two-stage process was then that we held a workshop day, so that we had, having been through and gathered all of that information about what the community valued, we got people to sit down in groups and really have a bit of a think about that. So basically to debate through these kind of questions. So given the things that were of value, then what did they think about different options that might be available for seawalls for protection or changing land use to think about things in a different way? Who might the winners and losers be? So who might do well if their asset was protected, and who might suffer as a result? What would those trade-offs be? And who were the key people who would need to be involved in those conversations to make it happen? So as a result of that kind of case study work, we came up with this. It's a bit of a busy diagram, I'm sorry, but just to kind of summarise, to have a successful community engagement process around this climate change issue, we said we needed the right data, so whether it's scientific inputs or local inputs in terms of the context that we were working in, a good team of people with the right mix of skills and good communicators to be able to bring things together, resources in terms of whether it's money or time to make sure that everybody was available to kind of come to these meetings and keep talking. And also support in terms of commitment from the people who are going to be ultimate decision makers about how they would value the decisions that came out of the community group and how they would move those forward. And moving through a kind of dialogue, debate and negotiation. So understanding the issues first before you get into talking about the trade-offs, before you kind of come up with a final plan. So that is me. The key message is, just as a reminder, that we do have change, so we need to get ready to adapt. That participation will help us get there if we all put the effort in to get there, but there's guidance to help everybody as well.